What if every moral argument you've ever made depended on something you cannot prove and cannot escape? In the previous episode, we explored C.S. Lewis's warning about a dangerous idea, the idea that moral judgments are nothing more than personal feelings. Lewis argued that if a civilization begins teaching this idea to its children, the consequences could be profound. Because moral education does not simply shape opinions, it shapes character, and without a shared understanding of value, the moral center of society begins to weaken. But Lewis believed the problem runs even deeper. Because if objective values are rejected, human beings cannot simply replace them with a new system of values. Why? Because every moral system already depends on something older, something more fundamental, what Lewis calls the Tao. Lewis uses the word Tao to describe something very specific. He is not referring to the Chinese philosophical tradition alone. Instead, he uses the term as a shorthand for the universal moral tradition of humanity, across different cultures, religions, and historical periods. Certain moral principles appear again and again. Respect for parents, condemnation of betrayal, admiration for courage, obligations of justice, protection of the innocent. Different civilizations express these ideas in different languages, but the underlying principles are remarkably consistent. Ancient Greece, classical China, medieval Europe, traditional African societies. Even cultures that developed independently often arrived at similar moral conclusions. For Lewis, this pattern suggests something important. These principles are not arbitrary inventions. They may reflect something real about the structure of human moral experience. You are never outside the Tao. According to Lewis, this shared moral inheritance forms the foundation of civilization itself. It shapes laws, customs, institutions, education. It provides the background assumptions that make moral reasoning possible. For example, when we argue that a policy is unjust, we assume that justice itself is a meaningful standard. When we praise courage, we assume courage is genuinely admirable. When we condemn cruelty, we assume cruelty is truly wrong. Imagine someone saying, "Cruelty isn't objectively wrong, it's just a matter of opinion." But if that same person is treated cruelly, they don't respond as if it's just an opinion. They respond as if something real has been violated. All of these judgments rely on a deeper moral framework, the Tao, and Lewis argues something crucial. Every attempt to criticize morally still depends on moral principles. Even moral skeptics appeal to values. Fairness, freedom, human dignity. In other words, even those who reject objective morality continue to rely on it, because you are never outside the Tao. Some modern thinkers didn't just question morality, they wanted to replace it entirely. Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, called for a revaluation of all values, a complete reconstruction of morality from the ground up. Others hoped morality could be rebuilt through science, psychology, or social planning, a purely rational system of values, a modern morality built on science or reason alone. Lewis believed this idea misunderstands how moral reasoning works. Because reason alone cannot generate values. Reason can help us understand facts. It can also help us calculate consequences, but it cannot tell us what is worth pursuing. Reason can explain how to build a bridge, but it cannot tell us whether building the bridge is good or bad. To answer that question, we must appeal to values, and those values already belong to the moral framework Lewis calls the Tao. This leads to one of Lewis's most important arguments. It is impossible to stand outside the Tao and judge it from a completely neutral position. Any attempt to reject the Tao must still rely on some part of it. Imagine someone arguing, we should abandon traditional morality in order to create a more compassionate society. but the moment they appeal to compassion, they have already invoked a value. And compassion itself belongs to the moral tradition they claim to reject. Lewis argues that this pattern appears again and again. Reformers claim to replace traditional values, yet the arguments they use depend on the very moral principles they criticize. They are not really escaping the Tao, they are borrowing from it. Lewis warns that rejecting the Tao does not produce a neutral moral landscape. It produces something far more dangerous, because once objective value disappears, morality does not vanish. It gets replaced by preference, by pressure, by power. Decisions about right and wrong become matters of control. Those who shape institutions, education, and technology may begin shaping values according to their own priorities. And when that happens, morality becomes something imposed, rather than something recognized. Lewis believed this situation would create a strange paradox. Modern societies might become more powerful than any civilization before them. Scientific knowledge would expand, technology would advance. Human beings might gain unprecedented control over nature, but at the same time, they would lose the moral framework that once guided how power should be used. Civilization would possess immense capability, but diminishing wisdom about what that capability is for, and that tension leads directly to Lewis's most controversial argument. In the final lecture of The Abolition of Man, Lewis explores what happens when humanity gains the power to shape human nature itself, through science, through social engineering, through the manipulation of human desires. At first this might sound like progress, but Lewis asks a disturbing question. If the people shaping the future no longer believe in objective moral values, what will guide their decisions? And if nothing guides them, then the future of humanity will not be discovered. It will be decided. I'll see you in the next episode.